2 red cards, a leg snapped in half, a goalkeeper's net stuffed 6 times, a jersey lifted to the sky like a fallen soldier's flag, and a full-scale brawl at the halfway line so ugly that FIFA volunteers had to physically drag bodies apart. This was supposed to be the night Canada finally got its moment. The night a football nation that had waited 4 decades for a World Cup victory would finally explode in celebration. 40 years of frustration, false dawns, near misses, heartbreak, and humiliation, all supposed to wash away under the lights of BC Place in Vancouver, with a home crowd roaring like it could shake the roof off the stadium and the Prime Minister himself sitting in the stands to witness history. Instead, what unfolded was not a coronation. It was not a party. It was not even really a football match by the end. It was a battlefield. A 6-goal demolition mixed with rage, revenge, injury, fear, and chaos so intense that by the final whistle, nobody was talking about the score first. They were talking about the war. So what actually happened in Vancouver? How did Canada's greatest World Cup night turn into one of the ugliest and most unforgettable matches of the entire tournament? Let's get straight into it. First, you have to understand what this game meant before a ball was even kicked. Canada were not just playing for 3 points. They were playing for a piece of history that had haunted them for generations. This was a country that had qualified for World Cups, yes, but had never actually won a match on the biggest stage. 40 years. Think about that. Players had come and gone. Entire football eras had risen and died. Kids had grown up, become adults, and had children of their own without ever seeing Canada win a World Cup game. That is the kind of burden that sits on a team's shoulders before the anthem has even finished. And now here they were, at home, in front of their own people, staring at a chance to finally break the curse. The atmosphere in Vancouver reflected that. It was not nervous in the way of a regular group stage game. It felt larger than that. It felt like a nation had collectively decided this was the night. This was the one. The crowd were not there to politely support. They were there to witness history and drag their team over the line if they had to. And to Canada's credit, they started like a team that understood the moment. There was no fear in their opening. No timid sideways passing, no cautious feel-out period, no sense of waiting to see what Qatar had to offer. Canada came out with the intensity of a side that had spent years imagining this exact stage. The pressing was aggressive, the movement was sharp, and every time they won the ball, they attacked with purpose. You could feel Qatar struggling almost immediately. They were being suffocated by the pace, the noise, the pressure, the occasion. Canada were not just trying to score first. They were trying to crush the game before Qatar had a chance to breathe. And when the breakthrough came, it felt less like a surprise and more like the inevitable result of a team refusing to let the moment pass them by. Sleen opened the scoring and BC Place erupted. It was the kind of roar that does not just celebrate a goal, it celebrates the release of years of tension. You could almost hear the history in it. For a split second, it looked like this might actually be the dream script. Early goal, crowd on fire, Qatar rattled, Canada in control. And then Jonathan David got involved. David, already one of the faces of Canadian football, chose the biggest stage imaginable to deliver the kind of performance that lives forever. He scored once, then again, and then again. A full World Cup hat-trick. Not in some scrappy group game that nobody remembers, but in the match that would become Canada's first ever World Cup win. Nathan Saliba bent in a beautiful free kick. Jacob Schaffelberg forced an own goal. By the time the dust settled, the scoreboard read 6-0. 6. At a World Cup. Against another national side on the biggest stage in football. It was not just a win. It was a demolition. It was the kind of score line that should have produced nothing but celebration, but that score line is also the biggest liar in this story, because when you hear 6-0, you picture one team cruising, smiling, maybe even showboating by the end. You picture a mismatch, a training exercise, a comfortable walk through 90 minutes. That is not what this was. Not even close. This match was vicious. It was ugly. It was mean. It was one of those nights where every goal only seemed to make the losing side more furious, more reckless, more dangerous. And it started to turn long before the final whistle, long before the brawl, long before the stretcher came out. The first signs were there in the tackles. At first, they just felt late. Then they felt hard. Then they felt personal. Qatar were not simply being outplayed, they were being humiliated, and some teams respond to humiliation by collapsing quietly. Others respond by trying to drag the entire game into the mud with them. Qatar chose the second option. The first huge warning sign came in the opening half when Homam Ahmed saw red. It was not one of those soft dismissals that gets debated for days. It was reckless, unnecessary, and stupid. A challenge born out of frustration rather than football intelligence. Jam Buchanan was on the receiving end, and the message it sent was obvious. Qatar were losing control, not just tactically but emotionally. Going down to 10 men in a World Cup match away from home against a rampant Canada side should have been the moment they regrouped and tried to survive with some dignity. Most teams would have dropped deeper, tried to limit the damage, maybe protect goal difference, maybe avoid embarrassment. But instead of calming down, Qatar got angrier. The red card did not cool the game. It poured gasoline on it. And that is what made the rest of the night so dangerous. Canada were still chasing history. Qatar were now chasing pride, but in the worst possible way. Every challenge started to feel like it carried extra venom. Every 50-50 looked like it might explode. Players were shouting more. The referee was losing the temperature of the match. The crowd could sense the edge to it. There is a moment in certain football matches where you stop watching purely as a fan and start watching with a knot in your stomach because you know something bad is coming. Vancouver reached that point, and then it went beyond it. Then came the moment that changed the entire emotional weight of the night. 51st minute. Canada were surging again, moving forward with the confidence of a side smelling blood. Ismail Kone, only 24 years old, one of the engines of this Canadian side, the kind of midfielder every team dreams of having, was in the middle of it. He was the heartbeat of their transitions, the player who linked defense to attack, the one who gave them balance and energy. And as he moved the ball, Aim Mebto came flying in from behind. Not shoulder to shoulder. Not a genuine attempt to nick the ball cleanly. Flying through the man. The challenge looked bad in real time and somehow felt worse the moment Kone hit the turf. He did not pop back up. He did not roll around looking for a foul. He grabbed his left leg and screamed. The body language of the Canadian players told the story before any replay ever could. Their arms shot up immediately, waving to the bench, screaming for medics, panic written across their faces. This was not the theatrical outrage players sometimes perform. This was fear, the kind where teammates stop arguing with the referee because the game itself no longer matters. Kone's injury felt like that. He stayed down, surrounded by medics, his face locked in that awful combination of shock and agony that tells you the body knows before the mind has fully caught up. Eventually, he was stretchered off with oxygen support, his World Cup over before he had even fully processed what had happened. And somehow, in the middle of his own nightmare, he lifted a hand and waved to the crowd. That image is almost too much when you think about it. A young player with a broken leg, leaving the biggest tournament of his life on a stretcher, trying to comfort tens of thousands of people who came to watch him make history. It stopped being just football in that moment. It became something much more human and much more heartbreaking. The referee initially reached for yellow. Yellow. That alone tells you how quickly a match can spiral when the officiating lags behind the violence on the pitch. VAR took one look and intervened. Straight red. Qatar down to 9 men. And by then, the score almost did not matter anymore. Of course, from a competitive standpoint, the game was dead. 9 men against 11, in a stadium already drowning them, against a Canadian team with too much quality and too much adrenaline. Qatar were finished. But emotionally, the match was only getting started. Because now Canada were no longer simply playing to win. They were playing angry. They were playing wounded. They were playing for Cone. That shift matters. Footballers can smell blood, but they can also smell injustice. Once Cone went down, Canada's entire energy changed. The goals that followed did not feel like routine additions to a comfortable lead. They felt like statements. They felt like punishment. They felt like a team trying to make the scoreboard say what the referee, and maybe the entire world, needed to understand about what had just happened. Nathan Saliba, the man who came on for the injured Cone, curled a free kick into the corner to make it 4. It was a beautiful strike, but what happened after mattered even more. Saliba did not celebrate like a man who had just scored at a World Cup. He ran to the sideline, grabbed a replica Cone jersey, held it up to the sky, and pointed to the number on the back. Number 8. For the teammate who had just been carried away. In one image, the entire night was captured: triumph, grief, brotherhood, fury, and a reminder that football's most powerful moments are often born from its ugliest ones. By then, Qatar looked broken in every sense. Physically, tactically, emotionally, they were done. Schaffelberg's shot deflected in off a defender for the 5th, and every Canadian attack now carried the sense that more damage was coming. The crowd, caught in the strangest emotional mix imaginable, celebrated because history was unfolding right in front of them, but there was also this layer of unease hanging over everything. How much joy are you supposed to feel when one of your own has just been taken away in that condition? How loudly do you celebrate a 6th when the player who helped build this moment is already in a hospital tunnel somewhere, his tournament over? That tension ran through the entire stadium and through the team on the pitch. This should have been a party. Instead, it felt like a wake mixed with a riot. And then Jonathan David put the exclamation mark on it. Deep in stoppage time, he completed his hat trick to make it 6-0, and on paper that should have been the crowning moment of the night. It was historic in every sense. David's hat trick was the 56th in men's World Cup history and only the second of the 2026 tournament after Lionel Messi had managed one against Algeria. But the bigger layer, the one that makes it truly absurd, is this: David became the first player from the entire CONCACAF region to score a World Cup hat-trick since 1930. Let that sink in. Nearly a century. Nearly 100 years without a player from North America, Central America, or the Caribbean producing a World Cup hat-trick, and the man who finally ended that drought did it on the same night Canada claimed its first ever World Cup win. It is the kind of achievement that should have dominated headlines for days. And yet even David himself could barely enjoy it. After the match, he admitted that once Cone went down, football stopped feeling like football. The focus disappeared. The joy of the goals became secondary. The players just wanted the game to end so they could be together and find out how bad it was. That tells you everything. When a player scores a World Cup hat-trick in the biggest win of his country's football history and still sounds emotionally detached from it, you know the night was carrying something heavier than numbers. Canada had achieved the result they had waited 40 years for, and still the dressing room atmosphere afterward was not pure celebration. It was concern. It was anger. It was relief mixed with guilt. They had won, yes. But they had paid for it, and if you thought the final whistle would finally allow everyone to breathe, think again. Because the second the game ended, the war restarted. Players from both sides converged at the halfway line, and whatever little thread of self-control remained snapped instantly. Shoving turned into screaming, screaming turned into bodies rushing in from everywhere, and suddenly you had players, substitutes, coaches, staff members, everyone piling into the same boiling mess at the center circle. It was not one isolated scuffle between two hot-headed players. It was a full bench-clearing confrontation. The kind of post-match scene that makes even neutral viewers sit up because you can feel how close it is to becoming something much worse. FIFA volunteers and team personnel had to physically get involved, pulling people apart, dragging shirts, separating groups, trying to stop the whole thing from collapsing into total mayhem. Think about that for a second. Canada had just won 6-0, recorded the biggest night in their World Cup history, and still by the end they were ready to throw hands in the middle of the pitch. That is how much rage had built up over those 90 minutes. And at the center of the explosion, according to reports, were the two managers. Jesse Marsch and Julen Lopetegui were seen talking on the touchline after the match, and at first glance it looked like one of those ordinary post-game exchanges managers have all the time. Maybe a quick handshake, maybe a few words about the match, maybe even a small gesture of respect after an intense night. But reportedly, something was said, something that changed the temperature instantly. We do not know the exact words, and maybe we never will, but whatever it was, it lit the fuse. Marsch's face changed, he gestured toward Lopetegui, and stormed away. It sounds like a tiny detail in a game filled with bigger moments, but sometimes football chaos works like that. The giant explosion is not caused by one giant event. It is caused by dozens of smaller tensions stacking on top of one another until one final sentence, one final push, one final stare tips the whole thing over the edge. And if Marsch's post-match comments are anything to go by, he was beyond furious. When asked about the confrontation, he dismissed it with the kind of cold answer that tells you he had nothing polite left in the tank. Talking about it, he said, was a waste of his time. That is not the response of a coach who wants to move on calmly. That is the response of a man choosing silence because the truth in his head is too sharp to say into a microphone. He had just watched one of his key players suffer a horrific injury. He had watched the game turn increasingly violent. He had watched his team's historic night get hijacked by brutality. Whatever was said after the whistle was never going to land well. Now FIFA's disciplinary committee is reportedly reviewing the post-match chaos, and that means this story still might not be over. Suspensions, fines, bans, retroactive punishment, all of that is potentially on the table when a match spills that far beyond normal football aggression. And honestly, it should be. Because when you count up everything that happened in those 90 minutes, it reads less like a match report and more like a disaster reel. Canada scored 6. Jonathan David authored a historic hat-trick. Qatar finished with 9 men after 2 red cards. Ismail Kone suffered a tournament-ending broken leg. A teammate raised his jersey to the sky in tribute. Players from both sides nearly came to blows after the whistle. Coaches left the field looking like enemies rather than professionals who had simply shared a difficult night. It was everything at once. Glory and grief. History and horror. Beauty and brutality stitched together into one impossible evening. And that is what makes this match so difficult to process. If you are Canadian, how do you even file it away in your memory? Is it the night your country finally won a World Cup match after 40 years of waiting? Of course it is. It has to be. No one can ever take that from them. The result is real. The history is real. The roar of the crowd when the goals went in, the image of David celebrating, the scoreboard showing 6-0, those things will live forever. But it is also the night a promising young midfielder had his tournament ripped away from him in one ugly challenge. It is the night your celebration was interrupted by a stretcher and oxygen mask. It is the night the post-match scenes looked more like a riot than a victory lap. It is the night joy came with a sick feeling in the stomach. That is the contradiction at the heart of football, and maybe especially at the heart of this World Cup. We talk about magical nights, historic moments, dream runs, and glorious upsets, and all of that is real. But so is the cruelty. So is the randomness. So is the way one mistimed tackle can alter a player's life and permanently stain a nation's happiest sporting memory. Canada got the result they had waited a generation to see. They got the hat-trick. They got the 6 goals. They got the statement win. But if you offered them the choice, if you said you can keep every single one of those things or you can walk away with Kone healthy, do you really think there would be hesitation? Of course not. That is why the mood after the match was so complicated. It was not fake humility. It was not media training, it was the simple truth that some victories hurt while they are happening. And from Qatar's perspective, this was catastrophic in a completely different way. Not just because they lost by 6, though that alone is humiliating enough on the World Cup stage. It is because they lost control of themselves. Teams can be outplayed. Teams can be tactically overwhelmed. Teams can run into a better side and get punished. That happens. But what is much harder to excuse is when frustration mutates into recklessness and then into outright damage. The red cards, the brutal tackling, the sense that the game was slipping from competition into vendetta, that is the part that will follow them. Because when the footage is replayed years from now, nobody is going to remember Qatar as the plucky side who just had a rough night. They are going to remember them as the team whose aggression helped turn Canada's dream night into a blood-soaked spectacle. And yet, even saying that, you still have to acknowledge how football creates these impossible emotional collisions. One team's greatest moment becomes entangled with another team's humiliation. One player's historic hat-trick gets overshadowed by another player's broken leg. A stadium that should have been bouncing in pure ecstasy ends up holding its breath in horror. That is why this match will be remembered long after plenty of technically better games are forgotten. Not because it was dutiful football from start to finish, though Canada's attacking display absolutely deserves praise, but because it had everything. It had narrative. It had stakes. It had violence. It had symbolism. It had history. It had that unforgettable image of a shirt raised toward the sky. It had a crowd living out a dream and watching part of it curdle into a nightmare in real time. So when people ask what happened in Vancouver, the answer is not simple. Canada won their first ever World Cup match. That is true. Canada demolished Qatar 6-0. Also true. Jonathan David wrote himself into the history books with a hat-trick no CONCACAF player had managed at a World Cup since 1930. True again. But those truths alone do not explain the night. The real story is that Vancouver witnessed a football match split cleanly in two. One half was history, catharsis, and national pride. The other half was violence, grief, and fury. One half belonged to the scoreboard. The other belonged to the stretcher, the red cards, the shouting, and the brawl. This was Canada's dream and Canada's nightmare sharing the same 90 minutes. They finally got the win. They finally got the release. They finally got a night their fans can point to forever and say, that was the moment our football story changed. But the cost of that moment was written all over the faces of the players when the game ended. Not relief alone. Not celebration alone. Something messier than that. Something more human. The understanding that football can hand you the greatest night of your career while also breaking your heart before the final whistle. That was the Battle of Vancouver. A 6-goal massacre, a historic hat-trick, 2 red cards, a shattered leg, a jersey tribute, and a post-match explosion that may still bring more punishment in the days ahead. One of the wildest, ugliest, most emotional matches of the 2026 World Cup, and maybe one of the most unforgettable nights in Canadian football history for all the right reasons and all the wrong ones. If this was worth your time, smash that like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, when you look back on this game, what is the real story of the night? Canada's historic first World Cup win, Jonathan David's legendary hat-trick, Cohn's heartbreaking injury, or the chaos that exploded after the whistle? I read every single one,